The music floated like silver threads through the air, weaving itself between clinking glasses and soft laughter. But none of it seemed to touch Clara Morgan. She sat at the edge of the ballroom, her chair angled just slightly away from the round table she'd been assigned, as though she had drifted there by accident. The wedding was grand, the kind that seemed to exist more for the photographers than for the guests, with chandeliers blazing overhead and polished floors glowing like mirrors. Women in glittering gowns spun gracefully in the arms of tuxedoed men, and every detail whispered wealth, confidence, belonging. Clara held her glass of sparkling water like a shield, bringing it to her lips whenever she caught someone's glance. Lingering too long, she knew what they were thinking alone, no date. How awkward. Her cousin, radiant in ivory lace, was at the center of it all, too wrapped in joy to notice Clara's quiet corner, and Clara didn't blame her. Tonight wasn't about her loneliness. Still, the soft hiss of whispers pricked her ears, and the weight of invisible judgment pressed against her chest. She hadn't always been this way. Once, she had been fearless, ready to laugh, ready to belong. But life has a way of carving silence into people, and Clara had learned how to shrink without anyone noticing. Tonight, she told herself she would survive the evening and slip away. Early, no one would remember if she stayed or left. No one would notice. Her fingers tapped against the glass, a restless rhythm she didn't even hear, until the scrape of a chair startled her. Someone sat down beside her, moving with the quiet confidence of a man who belonged anywhere he chose. Clara turned, surprised, and found herself staring into eyes the color of storm clouds, calm, yet charged with something she couldn't name. He wore a suit that seemed cut just for him, not flashy, but precise, like he wasn't trying to impress anyone and yet still managed to pretend you're with me, he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. Clara blinked. For a moment, she wondered if she'd imagined it, if her own longing for rescue had conjured him from thin air. But no, he was real, his arm resting casually on the table, his presence shielding her from the eyes that had been dissecting her solitude. "Why would I do that?" she asked, her voice more defensive than she intended. He smiled, not smug, not mocking, but with the kind of warmth that suggested he knew something she didn't. "Because everyone's watching, and it looks like you could use a friend tonight." Clara's first instinct was to refuse. She didn't know this man, didn't even know his name, and yet, in the quiet way he spoke, there was no demand, no expectation, just an offering, a simple choice. Her gaze flicked round the room, and sure enough, eyes that had been whispering about her a moment ago now slid away, uninterested, almost disappointed. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "Fine," she said softly. "Just for tonight." "Just for tonight," he agreed. The orchestra shifted into a waltz, couples rising again to take the floor. Clara would normally have stayed glued to her seat, pretending to be fascinated by the centerpiece of lilies and roses in front of her. But the stranger extended his hand, steady and patient. "I don't dance," she whispered. "Neither do I," he said, "but we can at least look like we do." Something about his tone loosened the knot inside her chest, and before she could argue herself out of it, Clara placed her hand in his. His grip was gentle yet sure, guiding her to the edge of the dance floor. She felt exposed, uncertain, but when he leaned closer and said, "Just follow me," it was as if the entire room softened, the edges of her fear blurring. They moved slowly, swaying more than dancing, but no one seemed to notice. To the outside world, they looked like any other couple lost in the music. For the first time that evening, Clara wasn't alone. Her mind raced with questions. Who was he? Why had he chosen her? What did he want? But each time she looked up into those gray eyes, she found only reassurance, as though the answers could wait. For now, all she had to do was trust the moment. The song ended, and applause rippled politely across the ballroom. He led her back to her seat, releasing her hand only once she was settled again. Clara stared at him, her heart still racing. "You never told me your name," she said. He leaned back slightly, a hint of mischief tugging at the corner of his lips. "Daniel, and you?" "Clara." "Well, Clara," he said, raising his glass. In a silent toast, "Tonight, you're not invisible." Her throat tightened. She hadn't realized how much she'd needed those words until he spoke them. And for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, this night could change everything. Clara barely slept that night. Long after the last champagne flute had been cleared and the final notes of music had faded, her mind still replayed the scene over and over again. She could still feel the warmth of Daniel's hand guiding her across the polished floor, still hear his voice in her ear when he whispered those words that had cut through her loneliness. Like a lantern in the dark, "Tonight, you're not invisible." It had been such a simple statement, yet it rattled her in a way that startled her. She had built an entire life around staying unseen, and in one evening a stranger had undone it with nothing more than presence. The city outside her window was hushed. When she pulled the curtains back, morning light spilled between the tall buildings, painting long shadows on the pavement. She traced a fingertip against the cool glass, trying to push away the unfamiliar ache that had settled in her chest. It was ridiculous, she told herself. He was just someone she met at a wedding, a man who had probably already forgotten her name, and yet, when she closed her eyes, the memory of his gaze lingered. By the following afternoon, Clara's phone buzzed with messages from family about the wedding. Cousins shared photos in a group chat, aunts reminisced about the food, uncles compared suits. Clara scrolled through them, pausing when she spotted herself in the background of one picture. She was actually dancing with Daniel. Her laughter was caught midair, her eyes brighter than she had seen them in years. For a moment, she didn't even recognize herself. She set her phone down, her pulse quickening. Who was he, really, and why did it matter so much to her to know? 2 days later, she had her answer. Clara was leaving her office building when she saw him. Daniel leaned casually against a lamppost across the street, dressed in a navy coat and scarf. The evening air was crisp, and the city hummed with the usual chaos. But the sight of him froze her in place. He caught her eye almost instantly, as if he had been waiting for her all along. "You," she said when she finally crossed over, her voice caught between disbelief and relief. "Me," he replied with a small smile. "I wasn't sure you'd recognize me without the suit. What are you doing here? Waiting." He said it as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world, but his gaze was steady, unwavering. Clara felt the weight of his presence all over again, the same way she had at the wedding. The city noise seemed to blur around them, the rush of traffic and the chatter of strangers dimming into background static. "Why?" she asked. "Because I thought you might need someone to remind you again," he said, "that you don't have to be invisible." The words lodged themselves deep inside her. She wanted to question him further, to demand explanations, but instead she found herself walking beside him. They moved through the city without a destination, the conversation flowing easily despite the fact that they were still strangers in every sense. He asked about her work, about her favorite books, about the little things that made her laugh. He listened as though every answer mattered, as though she were saying something profound instead of ordinary. For Clara, who had spent years feeling as though her words dissolved into the air, his attention was both unsettling and intoxicating. She tried to remind herself that this was temporary, that he was a stranger she had met by chance. But with each passing block, that reminder felt less convincing. When they stopped at a quiet cafe tucked between two brick buildings, Daniel held the door open for her. The place was dimly lit, the air scented with roasted coffee and vanilla. Clara chose a seat near the window, and he sat across from her. For the first time since they had met, she felt the weight of silence press between them. "Why me?" she asked finally. "At the wedding, you could have sat beside anyone. Why did you choose me?" Daniel leaned back, his eyes thoughtful. "Because you looked like someone who wanted to disappear, but didn't really want to. I've seen that before, and I know how heavy it feels." His answer left her breathless. He wasn't teasing. He wasn't flattering. He was simply telling the truth. And something about that honesty disarmed her more than any charm could have. They talked until the cafe began to close, and still, Clara found herself reluctant to leave. There was something about Daniel that unsettled the careful order she had built in her life. He didn't try to fix her, didn't push her to change. He simply sat across from her and reminded her that she existed, fully and completely. When he walked her home that night, he stopped at the corner outside her apartment building. The streetlight above them flickered softly, casting a glow that made the moment feel suspended, almost fragile. "Clara," he said quietly, "sometimes the smallest choice, a seat at a wedding, a walk through the city, can change everything. Maybe tonight is one of those choices." Her heart pounded in her chest. She wanted to ask what he meant, wanted to reach out and hold on to the strange steadiness he carried with him. But the words caught in her throat, and by the time she found them, he was already stepping away, his figure dissolving into the shadows of the street. Clara stood there long after he disappeared, her breath forming small clouds in the cool night air. For years she had been content to move through life like a ghost, unnoticed, untouched. And yet now, with nothing more than a whisper and a presence, a stranger had stirred something inside her she had thought was long gone. She didn't know if she would see him again. She didn't know if this was just a fleeting kindness or the beginning of something that would change her life. But as she climbed the stairs to her apartment, one truth pulsed through her with undeniable clarity. She was no longer invisible, and she wasn't sure she wanted to be. Clara woke the next morning with the echo of Daniel's words still circling her mind like a melody she couldn't quite shake. Maybe tonight is one of those choices. The phrase clung to her, unsettling in its simplicity, yet powerful in its truth. For so long, her life had been a string of routines: wake, work, return, home, repeat. She had convinced herself that this was safety, that this was enough. But now, the stillness of her apartment felt too quiet, the silence too heavy, as if his presence had awakened a restlessness she had forgotten existed. At work, her colleagues bustled around the office, gossiping about deadlines and promotions. But Clara drifted through the day half aware, her thoughts straying back to the cafe, to the way Daniel had looked at her as though she were more than just another face in the crowd. Every time she tried to dismiss it as chance, she felt a tug deeper inside her, the faint spark of something waiting to grow. By evening, the city stretched its lights against the dark sky, and Clara walked home slower than usual, half hoping she might see him leaning against that same lamppost, waiting. She scolded herself for the thought. It was foolish, almost childish, but her heart betrayed her with its quiet anticipation. When she reached her building, she saw nothing unusual. No familiar figure in a navy coat, no storm gray eyes cutting through the noise. She sighed, fumbling with her keys, when a folded note slipped out from beneath the handle of her mailbox. Her name was written in careful handwriting across the front. Her pulse quickened as she opened it. Some moments don't repeat themselves, but sometimes, if you're willing to look, they lead to others. If you'd like to find the next one, meet me tomorrow evening at the park, near the fountain. Clara's breath caught. The invitation was so simple, yet her chest ached with a mixture of nervousness and wonder. For years, no one had noticed her comings and goings, and now here was someone leaving her notes, asking her to step into the unknown. She pressed the paper to her chest, the faintest smile tugging at her lips. The following evening, she found herself standing near the fountain, the sound of rushing water masking the hum of the city beyond the trees. She felt almost foolish, waiting for a man she barely knew, but when she saw him approach, that thought melted away. Daniel walked with an ease that made the world around him seem slower, his coat brushing against the breeze, his eyes finding hers as though no one else existed. "You came," he said simply. "You asked," she replied, her voice softer than she intended. They sat on a bench near the fountain, and for a while, they didn't speak. The silence between them wasn't heavy this time. It felt almost sacred, as though words might disturb something delicate. Finally, Daniel turned to her. "Do you ever feel like your life isn't yours?" he asked. The question startled her. "What do you mean?" "Like you've been living on repeat, doing what's expected, keeping your head down, safe, predictable, but never really alive." Clara stared at him, the truth of his words striking too close. "Yes," she admitted quietly. "Every day." He nodded, as if he already knew her answer. "That's why I sat beside you at the wedding. You reminded me of myself once. I thought maybe you needed a reminder that you don't have to stay invisible forever." Her throat tightened. She wanted to ask what he meant by once, what had changed for him, but before she could, he stood and extended his hand once more. "Walk with me." They wandered through winding paths of the park, the glow of lamplight casting long shadows on the ground. Daniel spoke little, but when he did, his words felt deliberate, chosen with care. He asked about her dreams, not just the surface-level ones she sometimes mentioned to friends, but the ones she had buried long ago, the art she had abandoned, the trips she had never taken, the version of herself she had silenced. At first, she hesitated. It felt strange to speak these truths aloud, but Daniel listened with such patience that the wall she had built slowly began to lower. For every confession she made, he offered none of his own. His mystery deepened, and yet instead of pushing her away, it drew her closer. Like a lighthouse pulling a ship toward shore, they ended up on a quiet bridge overlooking the water. The city lights shimmered in the distance, and for a long moment, neither of them moved. Clara leaned against the railing, her hair catching the faint breeze, and Daniel stood close enough that she could feel the steadiness of his presence. "Why are you really here, Daniel?" she asked finally, her voice trembling with the weight of her own curiosity. "Why me? Why now?" For the first time, his expression shifted. Something shadowed, flickering across his face. He opened his mouth to answer, then closed it again, as though the truth was too heavy to release. "Because sometimes," he said at last, "you only get one chance to change the course of someone's story, and I didn't want to miss yours." The words stunned her, threading themselves into the fabric of her heart. Before she could respond, he touched the railing beside her hand, close but not quite touching. The air between them pulsed with an energy she couldn't explain, as if the city itself was holding its breath. Then, without another word, Daniel stepped back. "It's late," he said softly. "You should get home." And just like that, he turned and walked away, leaving her on the bridge with questions burning in her chest and an ache that made her want to call out for him to stay. But her voice caught in her throat, and all she could do was watch as he disappeared into the shadows once more. Clara's heart thundered. He had given her pieces of truth, but withheld the rest, and now her life felt like it was teetering on the edge of something vast and unknown. She gripped the railing, her breath trembling, knowing deep down that this was only the beginning, and that whatever came next, she could no longer hide from it. Clara couldn't shake the memory of the bridge, every detail replayed in her mind. With relentless clarity, the way the lamplight caught the curve of Daniel's jaw, the gravity in his voice when he spoke of changing someone's story, the hollow ache when he turned and left her standing there, unfinished. She had thought herself immune to longing after years of burying her heart beneath layers of practicality, but now each hour that passed without him felt stretched hollow and restless. She told herself not to wait. He was just a stranger, a fleeting presence who had drifted into her life by chance. And yet when she walked through the park again 2 nights later, her eyes betrayed her. Searching for him at the fountain, on the bench, on the bridge, there was no sign of him. But tucked into the corner of the railing, she found another folded note. "Some truths take time. Some truths can't be spoken all at once. If you're ready, meet me Friday at the old library on 5th. Her fingers trembled as she held the paper. There was a part of her that wanted to crumple it, to return to the safety of invisibility, where no one expected anything of her. But another part, a part she had almost forgotten existed, was curious, hungry, alive. She folded the note carefully, as though it were something fragile, and tucked it into her coat pocket. When Friday arrived, the library loomed before her like a cathedral of shadows and light. Its stone facade carried the weight of history, and inside, the vast hall smelled of aged paper and dust. The hush was almost reverent, broken only by the distant echo of footsteps. Clara walked slowly between towering shelves, her pulses steady, drumbeat in her ears, until she saw him. Daniel stood by the window, the fading light painting him in gold and shadow. He turned when she approached, his expression unreadable but softened by something she could not name. "You came," he said. "You asked," she replied, echoing their first meeting at the fountain. A small smile touched his lips, but it faded quickly, replaced by a seriousness she hadn't seen before. He gestured to a long wooden table, and they sat facing one another. the quiet of the library wrapping around them like a cocoon. "There are things I haven't told you," Daniel began. His voice was steady, but she sensed the weight behind each word. "Not because I didn't trust you, but because I wasn't sure if it was fair to place them on your shoulders." Clara's chest tightened. She had known from the start there was more to him than what he revealed. His presence, his careful words, the way he seemed to see through her, all of it hinted at a depth she couldn't quite touch. "What kind of things?" she asked softly. He exhaled slowly, his gaze drifting to the rows of books as though searching for courage among them. "The night I saw you at the wedding, you looked like someone drowning in silence. And I recognized it because I've been there too. I know what it's like to sit in a room full of people and feel invisible. I know what it's like to bury dreams, because it hurts less than chasing them and failing." His admission struck her like a chord vibrating in her bones. "But you don't seem invisible," she whispered. "That's because I learned the hard way," he said, his voice tightening. "Years ago, I let the world tell me I wasn't enough. I walked away from chances I should have taken, people I should have fought for. I disappeared, Clara. Not in the way you have, quietly, carefully, but in a way that nearly erased me. And when I saw you, I couldn't let it happen again. Not to you." Her eyes burned, though she blinked back the sting of tears. He wasn't just being kind. He was fighting a ghost of himself through her. "But why me?" she asked, her voice shaking. "You don't even know me." Daniel leaned forward then, his eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "I know enough. I know that you have more inside you than you've allowed yourself to show. I know you're stronger than the silence you've been living in. And I know that if you keep hiding, you'll lose pieces of yourself until there's nothing left. I saw it in your eyes the first moment I sat down. I couldn't ignore it." The air between them was charged, heavy with words unspoken. Clara's breath came shallow, her heart racing with a mixture of fear and hope. He was asking her to face things she had buried for years, to step into a life she wasn't sure she deserved. "I don't know if I can," she admitted. Daniel's voice softened. "You don't have to do it all at once, but you can take one step. Start with that. The rest will follow." They fell into silence again, the kind that wasn't empty, but brimming with meaning. Clara stared at the books lining the shelves, each one filled with stories, lives, choices. For the first time, she realized her own story didn't have to remain half-written. When they left the library, the city had grown quiet under the weight of night. Daniel walked her to the corner, his pace unhurried, as though he wanted to prolong the space between moments before she could step away. He turned to her, his expression fierce yet gentle. "Clara," he said, "don't mistake being unnoticed for being unworthy. You have more to give this world than you believe." Her throat tightened. She wanted to believe him, but belief had never come easily. Still, as she met his gaze, a flicker of something ignited inside her, fragile but real. When he left her at her door, she lingered long after his footsteps faded, clutching the note from her pocket like a talisman. For the first time in years, she didn't feel invisible. She felt seen, raw and trembling, but undeniably alive. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the fear and doubt, a quiet thought whispered, "Maybe my story isn't over. Maybe it's only just beginning." The following week unfolded like a blur, but Clara felt something shifting inside her with every passing day. The city still bustled, deadlines still crowded her desk, and the world outside continued at its usual dizzying pace. But within her, a fragile pulse of change had begun. It was in the way she caught herself looking people in the eye instead of lowering her gaze. It was in the way her voice held steadier in meetings at work. It was in the way she noticed colors again, the amber of late afternoon sunlight spilling across her desk, the deep emerald of ivy curling over a brick wall she passed each morning. Small things, but they whispered of life stirring where silence had once ruled, and yet doubt lingered like a shadow at her heels. Daniel's words had ignited something, but a part of her still questioned whether it was real. Could someone truly rebuild themselves after years of retreat? Or was she clinging to the glow of a stranger's belief because she had none of her own one evening? As she prepared to leave the office, her manager, Mr. Harlan, stopped her. He was older, respected, a man who carried authority in the way his voice filled a room. "Clara," he said, "I want you to take the lead on the Kensington account. You've got the sharpest instincts on the team. It's time you stepped forward." The words froze her. Lead, present, stand in front of clients who would measure her with critical eyes. The old Clara, the one who shrank into the background, would have smiled politely and declined, deferring to someone louder, more confident. But the new Clara, the one Daniel seemed to believe in, hesitated on the edge of possibility. Her heart pounded, her palms prickled, but after a long pause, she nodded. "I'll do it." That night, she barely slept, fear tangled with anticipation as she rehearsed in her head, pacing her small apartment until the city outside quieted into the stillness of dawn. And when morning came, she dressed carefully, her navy blazer pressed, her notes neatly tucked into her bag. The conference room was wide and sterile, its glass walls revealing the skyline beyond. Executives from the Kensington firm sat across the table, expectant and unreadable. Clara stood at the head, her breath tight in her chest. For a heartbeat, the old panic surged, the weight of invisibility whispering, "You don't belong here." But then she remembered Daniel's voice in the library, firm and steady. "Don't mistake being unnoticed for being unworthy." Clara took a breath and began. At first, her voice trembled, but as the words left her, something inside her steadied. She spoke not from fear, but from the knowledge she had buried for years. She saw the nods, the pen's scribbling notes, the flicker of genuine interest in the executive's eyes. By the time she finished, the room felt transformed, alive with energy she had sparked. When the meeting ended, her manager clasped her shoulder. "I knew you could do it," he said, and this time, Clara believed him. That evening, she walked through the park, her steps light, her chest buzzing with exhilaration. She found herself at the fountain again, scanning the crowd, half hoping, half dreading, and then she saw him. Daniel was there, leaning against the stone edge, his eyes finding hers instantly as though he had been waiting all along. "You look different," he said when she approached. Clara laughed softly, shaking her head. "I don't feel different, just braver, maybe. That's more than enough." She told him about the presentation, about the way her voice had almost failed her, and then found its strength. He listened quietly, his expression unreadable, but proud. "You see," he said finally, "it was always inside you. All I did was remind you." Clara studied him, a knot of gratitude and curiosity tightening in her chest. "Why do you care so much? You hardly know me, yet you've given me more than anyone else ever has." Daniel's gaze darkened slightly, a flicker of something he was holding back. "Because I know what it's like to need someone to see you. And because—" He stopped, as if the words were too heavy. Then he shook his head. "Because some chances are too important to waste." The mystery in his tone unsettled her, but before she could press him, he changed the subject. They walked beneath the trees, the air cool and fragrant with the promise of spring. For the first time, Clara allowed herself to enjoy the moment without questioning it. The city lights shimmered like stars, the water of the fountain whispered in the background, and beside her walked the man who had reminded her that she existed. When they reached her street, Daniel paused. "Clara, every step you take now is yours. Don't let fear erase that. Promise me you won't." "I promise," she whispered, her voice catching. He nodded, satisfied, and turned to leave. But this time, Clara reached out, her hand brushing his sleeve. "Daniel," she said, her throat tight with unspoken questions. "I want to know who you are, really." He met her gaze, the weight of unspoken truths heavy between them. "You will," he said softly, "but not yet." And then he was gone, leaving her once again with her thoughts, her heart pounding, and the undeniable sense that her life was hurtling towards something far greater than she had ever imagined. As she stood under the streetlight, the city alive around her, Clara realized the truth. She was no longer invisible. She was becoming someone she had almost forgotten she could be. And though Daniel's secrets pressed at the edges of her curiosity, she knew one thing with absolute certainty: her story was no longer standing still. It was moving, pulsing, a live dot, and for the first time in years, she wasn't afraid of where it might lead. The city had begun to change with the season, the air warmer now, carrying with it the promise of new beginnings. But for Clara, The shift wasn't only in the weather. It was in the way she walked through the streets, no longer shrinking from the crowd but moving among it with her shoulders straighter, her steps lighter. It was in the way people at work turned to her now for guidance, their eyes meeting hers with respect she hadn't dared imagine. And most of all, it was in the way her reflection no longer startled her when she looked in the mirror. She saw someone alive, someone present, someone who belonged. But with every small victory, one truth pressed harder against her: Daniel's absence. He appeared and disappeared like a tide, never for long enough, never with enough answers. She wanted more than fragments, more than whispers and notes left in unexpected places. She wanted the whole of him, and yet, each time she asked, he gave. Her only promise is not yet, but soon. One evening, as twilight bled into the city skyline, Clara found another note slipped beneath her door. It's time you knew everything. Meet me tomorrow at the old theater on 7th. Her hands shook as she held the paper. A mixture of fear and anticipation swirled in her chest. She knew this was at the moment that would either anchor everything they had built or shatter it completely. The next evening, the theater loomed before her, a relic of another age. Its once grand facade was faded, its marquee dark, but it held a quiet majesty, as though it had been waiting all these years for someone to walk back inside. Clara pushed open the heavy doors, the scent of dust and velvet filling her lungs. The cavernous space was lit only by the faint glow of the stage lights, and there, standing at the center, was Daniel. He looked different, somehow more fragile, though his eyes carried the same stormy depth. When he saw her, his lips curved into a faint smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. You came, he said, his voice softer than usual. You asked, she answered. The words now a familiar echo between them. For a moment, neither of them moved. The silence stretched, charged with everything unspoken. Then Daniel gestured for her to join him. She crossed the stage, her footsteps hollow against the worn wood, until she stood before him. There are things I've hidden, he began, his gaze fixed on the empty seats of the theater. Not to deceive you, but because I didn't know if you were ready. I wasn't sure if I was ready. Clara's chest tightened. Ready for what? He turned then, and the weight of his eyes nearly stole her breath. The truth. About who I am. About why I found you. Her heart raced, every nerve bracing for what he might reveal. I wasn't at that wedding by chance, Daniel said slowly. I knew I would see you there. I knew because I asked to be invited. Clara's pulse quickened. Why? Because of your cousin, he said. She and we crossed paths years ago. She mentioned you once, not by name, but she spoke of a friend who had grown quiet, who had faded from the world though she once burned brightly. It struck me. And when I heard she was getting married, I knew you would be there. I didn't know what I would say or what you would see in me, but I couldn't stay away. And when I saw you sitting alone, he paused, his voice breaking slightly. I couldn't let the chance slip through my hands. Clara stared at him, her breath uneven. So you sought me out, not by accident, but on purpose. Yes, his voice was steady now, because I saw in you what I once lost in myself, and I couldn't stand by and watch it happen again. I needed to remind you before it was too late. Her thoughts swirled in chaos, the ache of betrayal warred with the warmth of gratitude. He hadn't been a stranger guided by chance. He had chosen her, sought her, carried his own reasons for appearing in her life. Why didn't you tell me sooner? She whispered. Because I was afraid, Daniel admitted. Afraid you'd turn away. Afraid you'd see me as someone who interfered instead of someone who cared. The rawness in his voice cut through her confusion, silencing the storm of questions. For the first time, she saw not just the man who had whispered strength into her life, but the man who bore his own scars, his own regrets. Clara stepped closer, her hand trembling as she reached for his. Daniel, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't care how it started. I care what it became. I care that you saw me when I couldn't see myself. His eyes closed briefly, as if her words carried both pain and relief. When he opened them again, they glistened in the dim light. You don't know how much I needed to hear that. They stood in silence, the weight of honesty settling around them. Not crushing but freeing. Clara felt something inside her shift, a final lock breaking open. She had feared the truth might unravel everything, but instead it stitched them closer together, binding them in the fragile, beautiful fabric of vulnerability. "Clara," Daniel said softly, "you've been writing a story without realizing it. Every choice you've made these past weeks, the presentation, the courage to speak, the courage to stand here now, it's proof that you're not invisible anymore. You've taken your life back." "And you?" she asked. "What about your story?" He looked out at the empty rows of seats, his expression distant. "Mine is still being written, but for the first time in a long time, I don't feel like I'm writing it alone." Something in those words rooted itself deep inside her. For years, Clara had believed she had to move through the world unseen, unneeded, unwanted. Now, standing on that empty stage with Daniel beside her, she felt the undeniable truth. Her story wasn't a background tale. It was one worth telling, one worth living out loud. She squeezed his hand, her voice steady. "Then let's keep writing, together." Daniel looked at her then, really looked, and for the first time since they met, the storm in his eyes softened into something calm, something certain. The theater lights flickered once, as if acknowledging the moment, and Clara felt a quiet peace settle over her. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring. She didn't know if their stories would remain intertwined or if they would one day part ways. But she knew this: she was no longer invisible. She was no longer afraid. And whatever chapters lay ahead, she was ready to face them, not as the woman who once sat alone at a wedding, but as someone who had learned, through the whisper of a stranger, that she was worth being seen.